One of the most significant issues of our day, culturally, politically, and theologically, is whether persons with same-sex attraction can marry each other. The Roundtable will discuss that next.
Ave Regina Caelorum, Ave Domina Angelorum, Salve radix, salve porta, ex qua mundo lux est orta.
Welcome to the EWTN Theology Roundtable. I'm your host, Colin Donovan, Vice President for Theology here at EWTN, and I'm joined on the panel today by Father Mark Mary Christina of the Franciscan Missionaries of the Eternal Word, and by David Gregson and Tom Nash of our own Theology Department. And we're here today to discuss the question of same-sex marriage. The last 30 to 40 years has seen quite a change in our culture, and even in our churches and synagogues regarding whether or not same-sex attractions are morally legitimate and whether or not same-sex individuals may marry each other. And although a large portion of the American population still oppose the idea of same-sex marriage, as illustrated by at least election results in different places, nonetheless, it seems to be a movement which is progressing. And the church has tried to address this from different directions. And those directions tend to be from the point of view of reason, natural law as it is called, and from the point of view of the church's faith, theology, divine revelation, sacred scripture, tradition, and the judgments of the magisterium about those areas in the course of the centuries. I think that should be our starting point, Father Mark. What exactly is the church saying about the question of same-sex marriage?
Well, we say the church teaches that marriage is a basic human and social institution. It's not created by a religious institution or government. It's written in our very natures. We can see that, from the very beginning of mankind. And that it's a union of a man and a woman on the level of mind and body. And it involves this totality that's rooted in the sexual difference, the difference of gender, that also has this incredible possibility to procreate, to generate life. But as Christians, as Catholics, we say that the marriage between the baptized is raised to the dignity of a sacrament. It's a sign of the covenant between Christ and His church. But it's fundamentally this basic human institution raised to the dignity of the sacrament, and that it forms a bond between the man and the woman. It's a special bond. It's a union, as I said, that's rooted in a sexual difference that it's different from any other relationship. It's a unique relationship where the two can come together and act as one. We see that especially in procreation, the procreative act. So it unites the couple, rooted in their sexual difference, and that enables the couple to give mutual help, to assist one another in their love for each other, and to generate life. There's this beautiful complementarity that the church teaches, that it's greater, the two becoming one, than what they can have apart from each other. And I think at the heart of this debate is that we're talking about a unique reality that people of the same sex coming together in a loving relationship cannot have. This is unique and special.
Now, there's certainly, I think, in the church's approach, and even historically, of course, there are elements of condemnation of homosexual behavior in both religious and non-religious societies. But at the same time, the approach has been overall positive in terms of simply identifying, as Father Mark did regarding what the church believes about marriage, identifying what marriage is as a natural institution. And that's actually a very old area of investigation for thinkers on these subjects.
Yes, the Greek philosophers were concerned with the relationship of marriage and family to the state. For Plato, the state is absolute, and marriage was sort of a temporary expedient, at least among the elite classes, to produce children, which were then put in nurseries and raised for state purposes. Aristotle, however, differed from him on this, and he said that the family is fundamental, and of course that's based on the relationship between male and female in an abiding relationship. the state is made up of component parts, and the most basic of these is the procreative union of male and female.
Dave, who exactly was Aristotle in this context? Many of our listeners may not be familiar. They may have heard that name, but really don't have any context for who he was in terms of when he was writing and so on.
He was an Athenian philosopher who was a disciple of Plato, but differed from Plato on important points. Plato tended to emphasize the universal. Aristotle emphasized the concrete particular, and you see this in the case of the state. Plato emphasized the state as the universal having more reality and more importance. Aristotle, the components of the state, which were primarily the family.
And importantly, a pre-Christian writer, a writer who himself in a polytheistic society, but yet rejected polytheism in terms of the idea that there had to be a prime mover, a first cause of everything in reality, and so had an insight, a natural philosophy insight into the existence of God.
Right. His God was not a God who was concerned with human beings, but he was one, and the goal of all the universe.
What are some of the other intellectual influences historically that we see?
Well, to continue with an important point on Aristotle, he taught that everything has a purpose. Not only man-made things, but natural things as well. As with man, we have legs for walking, we have teeth for chewing. Nothing just is, it is for something. Though the whole universe is a rational system. God is at the center of it, and all things yearn towards God in some indirect, perhaps, way. But He is the good, the goal of everything, and the ultimate purpose of all creation. Roman intellectuals took up Greek philosophy, and it helped guide their view of law, their view of the state, and their view of morality, even when their practice diverged from the ideal. In Roman law, matrimonium, or nuptiae, was the union of male and female, a consortium for the whole of life. The word matrimonium comes from the word mater, which implies that it was fundamentally the change of a woman to a mother, bearing children. Marriage in Roman law was not a romantic pairing, but an arrangement to produce citizens for Rome. The parties had to have connubium. Connubium was the right to marry. It was limited to Roman citizens, and they could only marry other citizens. Conditions for connubium included the consent of both parties. They had to be outside the prohibited degree of kinship.
Again, a procreative idea behind that. Why prohibit it otherwise?
Right. They had to have reached sexual maturity, and they had to be unmarried. This was both a legal and a sacred relationship because the state was almost deified, and marriage contributed to the good of the state. Christian philosophers looked to this philosophical tradition for a reasoned explanation of marriage and the family to complement what had been revealed through Moses and Christ. They focused less on marriage's relationship to the state and more on marriage as the only proper context for sex and procreation. St. Augustine, following St. Paul, condemned all sex outside of marriage. It's for the sake of begetting children with a secondary purpose of quenching the appetites that might lead to infidelity. Marriage is justified by its good, according to St. Augustine, its goods. The three goods of marriage are essential properties which distinguish this covenant from all other relationships. To quote St. Augustine on the grace of Christ and original sin, marriage is a good in all the things which are proper to the married state, and these are three. It is the ordained means of procreation, it is the guarantee of chastity, it is the bond of union.
And of course, Augustine was not the only one to speak on this. The high point in the Middle Ages would have been St. Thomas Aquinas, who readily fits into that long intellectual tradition.
Right. St. Thomas based similar judgments on marriage and sexual morality, similar to those of St. Augustine, but St. Thomas based them also on natural law. St. Thomas followed Aristotle in viewing the world as a rational system. Man has a purpose, and by examining his nature we can learn what God intends for us and what is contrary to God's intent. This standard for human conduct reflected in our nature is called natural law. Man by nature seeks his own good, and fundamental to his good is his self-preservation. As a species, this means propagation, the bearing and rearing of children. This is the purpose of marital sex, to preserve the species. St. Thomas defines marriage from the Summa Theologica. Now, the form of matrimony consists in a certain inseparable union of souls by which husband and wife are pledged by a bond of mutual affection that cannot be sundered. And the end of matrimony is the begetting and upbringing of children, the first of which is attained by conjugal intercourse, the second by the other duties of husband and wife, by which they help one another in rearing their offspring.
It's interesting that he combines the element of the mutual affection. In other words, we would say today, you know, the love aspect, because that's always raised that, well, historically people had arranged marriages and so on. Today, we're more concerned about love, and that justifies, you know, marriages regardless of other circumstances. And there is that element of mutual attraction, but it's ordered to these natural purposes, which Aristotle and others have defined.
Right, ultimately, the preservation of the species.
Right. It's the appetite that encourages us to do that, because both its purpose and the pleasure which the use of that faculty gives. And therefore that pleasure is ordered not to individual delight per se as an end, but to the preservation of the species. It's interesting that all of this tradition, of course, the current canon law has a history, and that history is the previous code of canon law of the church and the historical canons on marriage, whether the doctrinal canons at Trent or different things that have been said since essentially canon law was founded in the 1100s. But the current code of canon law has most of these elements we've talked about from the pre-Christian tradition as well as the early Christian philosophical tradition. Canon 1055 says the matrimonial covenant by which a man and a woman establish between themselves a partnership of the whole of life, and which is ordered by its nature to the good of the spouses and the procreation and education of offspring, has been raised by Christ to the dignity of a sacrament between the baptized. So both the natural elements, the idea in the Latin word there for partnership is consortium, a word used by the Romans for this same institution. But then, of course, it also mentions a supernatural purpose established by Christ. Tom, this brings us to the strictly theological, and that is Scripture and tradition has certain things, especially sacred Scripture, which confirms what the natural law tells us, and which even non-Christians have seen and discovered. But even then it goes beyond that, and divine revelation, of course, has much to say on it.
Yes, Colin, like you pointed, and we've heard Father Mark discuss that it's an institution that wasn't started by religion. You mentioned the natural law, which David mentioned explicitly. Father Mark pointed out that you can reason to it, and therefore you don't need revelation per se. And we see that consistent with the Greeks and the Romans, and that Scripture affirms that and goes deeper. I mean, it affirms that it is that intimate, exclusive, permanent, lifelong communion of love and life between a man and a wife, I mean between a husband, a man and a woman, and that it's crowned in children, but that it's consent that makes the marriage. You know, we see that people get married and they exchange vows. They're married validly on their wedding day, of course, consummated, because the two become one in one sense when they marry, but also engaging in the marital act, consummation seals that covenant. So we see that even if you can't have children, It is a valid marriage between a man and a wife, but yet crowned in children. That's why I talked about 2-in-1 flesh communion, as we'll see. And in Genesis chapter 1, verses 26 to 28.
So these are the scriptural fonts of the church's theological understanding.
The creation accounts in Genesis, where we see first in Genesis 1, then God said, let us make man in our image, after our likeness. So God created man in his own image. In the image of God, he created him. Male and female, he created them. And God blessed them. And God said to them, be fruitful and multiply, and fill the earth and subdue it. And then in Genesis chapter 2, we read beginning in 18, it says, then the Lord God said, it is not good that man should be alone. I will make a fit helper for him, a helper that is fit for him. And then it goes on in 2:24, just a couple of verses, several verses later, it says, a man shall leave his mother and father and cleave to his wife, and the two shall become one flesh. So we see the importance that marriage begins, is made valid through consent and sealed through consummation. That is participation in the marital act, ultimately crowned in marriage, but ultimately crowned in procreation, the having of children, but that itself, having the children, doesn't make the marriage valid to begin with, although it does crown it.
And it's unfortunate that there has been a lot of propaganda in recent years from books by Boswell and others trying to say that this doesn't mean what the obvious sense of the text means, and even with different theories of, Adam is sort of an androgynous person, and all of the sexes and genders that are today described as the spectrum of human sexuality came from that androgynous person, ignoring the clearly male, female, and procreative dimension affirmed in these texts.
And we see that too in Genesis 19, where Sodom and Gomorrah is punished. And where do we get the word sodomy from? But from that account, Genesis 19, so that we see that same-sex relations, whether a man or between two men and two women, is condemned, charitably stated, in the Genesis account and elsewhere, also in the New Testament.
What else can we say about the scriptural sources of the church's teaching?
It affirms that only in marriage is sexual expression morally legitimate. We see in the Mosaic covenant that fornication and adultery are both severely punished. We see also
as homosexuality, which the act of it, as opposed
absolutely,
to
which we saw first in Genesis 19, and of course it's condemned in the Mosaic covenant as well. In addition to which, we know that monogamy is to be the standard, that polygamy is practiced, but we can look at things without getting a lot of detail. When Abraham, gets a concubine, gets in trouble with Sarah, the offspring end up going their different ways, Ishmael and Isaac, and problems in their future descendants. We also see with somebody like Solomon, takes 300 wives, 700 wives, 300 concubines. That's a problem for any person. It's going to distract you from God. He gets into all kinds of trouble. So we know that not following the monogamous ideal gets you into trouble, as well as divorce, though tolerated after a while, ultimately
and I think
we
that's
see condemned.
The key thing in terms of the specifically Christian revelation is that prior to Christ, with the absence of the graces of the redemption to support human nature to overcome its drives and inclinations, there was a great deal tolerated. Now, simply because man would not have been incapable of living otherwise in those circumstances without grace. But that it's important to note that some will say, well, that's fine. When Christ said, for instance, no more divorce, but he didn't say anything about same-sex marriage or homosexual practice. Therefore, clearly he was open to the idea. I think the Gospels do not affirm that at all.
No, and let's take a look at what Jesus said in Matthew 19, verses 4 to 5. He says, have you not read that he who made them from the beginning made them male and female, and said, for this reason a man shall leave his father and mother and be joined to his wife, and the two shall become one flesh. There's that to become one flesh again. He's affirming what we first heard in Genesis. And what therefore God has joined together, and let man not put asunder. So he affirms that it is a permanent covenant, putting aside that Mosaic toleration. Toleration is not endorsement.
Right.
But he also affirms the love-giving unitive dimension, that the two become one. Of course, from that, we get children. So it's quite clear that he's saying no divorce, polygamy is not on the table. And you mentioned about the whole issue of homosexuality. That's not even on the table. That's not even on the radar. This whole thing was about divorce. And so to try to think that Jesus was giving a allowance by omission makes no sense, because that wasn't even on his radar. And let's remember that Jesus was rather countercultural, was he not? He was not afraid to rock the boat. He was not afraid to say things that would cause his death. If he wanted to be a reformer, he would have made a point on it, and that is absurd. St. Paul, of course, we see later on, makes it very clear in Romans, and then we also see later on in the Didache in the early church fathers that the church's teaching on same-sex relations is affirmed.
Okay, well, when we come back, we're going to pick up that topic again, and we'll see what we can learn from the sciences today on the subject of same-sex marriage.
Salve radic, salve porta, ex qua mundo lux est orta. Ave Regina Caelorum, Ave Domina Angelorum, Salve radic, salve porta.
Okay, we're back, and we were discussing the Gospels and what Christ had to say on the subject of marriage, and we saw that it was a positive portrayal, a reaffirmation of the ideal promulgated in Genesis of the union, the one flesh union of man and woman. And it is indeed silent on the issue of homosexuality and same-sex marriage, not because Christ would be proposing alternative relationships to that which he was reaffirming, but simply because it would have been unthinkable for a Jew of that century, indeed an Orthodox Jew today, that to believe that anything other than heterosexual relations within marriage were morally acceptable. Whether it was fornication or sodomy or anything else, it would have been considered gravely wrong, and still is within that tradition today. So clearly this was the starting point, the words of Jesus, which the Didache, an early church document, the teaching of the 12 apostles, also affirming marriage as we understand it, as the intellectual tradition of Greek and Rome, as well as Israel understood it, and carried on into the fathers and doctors of the church, as David was explaining earlier. Now today, one of the mallets used against this point of view has been science. Some put forward the position that science has overthrown the idea that there is male and female. Of course, there was a period of time when some scientists were looking to find a gay gene in order to say that nature itself had designed homosexuality, and therefore it was simply a variant of human behavior. No such thing has been found. Indeed, one would have to say, from the point of view of biology alone or evolutionary biology, that there's nothing adaptive about homosexuality, and unless homosexuals engage in heterosexual relations, of course prior to the advent of the technologies we have today, it would have been impossible to communicate that gene. So it couldn't have been perpetuated in the genome except through heterosexuality. And so that has never been found, and simply won't be found. Now, it is certainly true that science has shown that what we know as the genetic identity of females, the two X chromosomes, and the genetic identity of males, or the male phenotype, an X chromosome, or genotype, X chromosome, and a Y chromosome, that there is variability in nature, but it's not a designed variability. It comes about through errors in the division of cells, either in the woman or the man, in the production of their germ cells, or in the fusion of their two germ cells, and in the development of the embryo and the child in the womb. And so we do know that there are variations on masculinity and femininity in a middle region between the two that result because of these genetic errors, because of environmental factors in the womb, and sociological factors outside the womb. In fact, recent studies have pointed to the sociological and the environmental being far and away the larger influence in why someone would have a same-sex attraction. So science seems to be saying, well, if it's found in nature, then it's natural. But in reality, it's no more natural than, say, an inclination to heterosexual, promiscuous, or to any other serious sin. And so therefore, as a result, we have to say that the church provides both the reason, original sin, as well as the cause of the inclination, the concupiscence, the disordered inclinations that resulted from original sin. And this is sufficient explanation without having to twist the science to suggest that nature has designed as some adaptive characteristic, if one takes a purely evolutionary view, an adaptive characteristic of the human race, and therefore that it is normal in that sense. Of course, this is necessary in order to elevate it to the level of a right, along with race and sex and so on, or race and other characteristics which are recognized as normal features of human nature. You need to have such a scientific basis, and that is why this viewpoint of this spectrum of genders being a natural design, if you will, or result of nature, has to be promoted and is widely promoted in order to dismiss religion and in order to confuse believers regarding whether this is a result of original sin and personal disordered inclinations, or this is something to be exalted and elevated and granted equality with, with gender, male and female, with nationality, with religion, with race. And so it has been a big club that is being used today, and it's also quite a lie. And it's an atheistic point of view, and I think Catholics and other believers, Christian and Jewish and others, must recognize that it's essentially an atheistic view. It makes man the object of purely mechanistic forces, of material forces that have no connection to God whatsoever. And therefore God is not the one who gives order to the universe, the rationality that even the pagan Aristotle saw in the universe, that cosmologists and astronomers today are seeing everywhere: rationality, design, order, mathematical precision. And yet we are to say with regard to human beings, big chance, big collection of opportunistic changes and with no design and direction. No, there is design and direction in which negative opportunistic changes influence. Changes which, negative things which we all carry in our genetics and which influence our behavior, but which are not the will of God and certainly not nature's design, because they do not serve any adaptive purpose. So I think it needs to be clear on the arguments from science that are put forward that they are not scientific at all. They're ideological. They're based on a materialistic and atheistic philosophy, and therefore it's not something that a believer should say, oh well, live and let live, I don't have any position on this, I don't care. It really is a large axe that is being used against religions, Christianity in particular, and Catholics, the Catholic Church in particular. And I think the other aspect of this scientifically, as we have abandoned a morality in our use of technologies, medical technologies, whether it's contraception or in vitro fertilization, heterosexuals have given away the right to be hypocrites, if you will, and say, well, other sexual behaviors are wrong. If you're contracepting, If you're using pornography, if you think, oh, well, it's all right, you know, it's no big deal, nobody's being hurt, you're having children by in vitro fertilization. How are you going to be criticizing others who wish to have their sexual orientations, proclivities, and so on? You can't. And this is being used in our culture. So I think for the rest of the program, we want to address these issues, some of the cultural questions that are being asked. And the first one, naturally, we put these together before the roundtable, so we know what we'd be talking about. But Father Mark, I want to ask you, gee, Father, if two people love each other, why shouldn't they be allowed to get married, for heaven's sakes?
You're going to make me the bad guy here.
Yes, you are the bad guy here.
You're against
You represent the church, the bad institution.
All right. Well, that certainly is the rationale given for gay marriage, is that they present it just simply as an emotional union, that two people can have a love of friendship for one another, but marriage is more than that. Marriage is, and that's why the government's involved at all, right? The government doesn't regulate friendships, but the government knows from experience, you know, society knows from experience, there's something special about this relationship that the government does have a say to promote and to foster for the common good. And that, you know, marriage is about a unique union, as I mentioned before, that's based in and rooted in sexual complementarity, that the sexes, male and female, enrich one another. And that's the very nature of love, right? That we go out of ourselves to give to the other. And that's especially symbolized in the marital relationship, right? Because as Tom was pointing out, part of Christian revelation is that, you know, we image God on an individual level as a man or a woman, but also as a communion of persons. There's a special image of God and a special revelation of God, a special revelation of what love is, going out of yourself to give to the other. So it's not a union of just simple identity, two friends coming together. It's a unique relationship that they can act as one, right, in giving life. That's a special sign result of that.
And you point to something that has tremendous theological consequences. Man and woman being image of God points to God who creates outside himself, his relationship to his creation and to us, and to God who receives that in the total gift of self, the Father giving to the Son. If you adopt the position that male female has no analogy to what is in the Godhead, but rather it's simply male and female, male or female, this changes our theology tremendously. God is a goddess, she is a she is a mother. And these are used as adjectives, certainly with regard to God's, you know, motherly love, his womb love for us, nurturing us like a mother. And mothers do have marked in them a dimension of God's love. But it does change our theology of the Trinity, right, and many other things if you adopt a sort of androgynous view of human nature.
Right, like two people of the same sex cannot unite bodily as the difference allows, the sexual difference allows. And that, I think, is at the heart of the... Not
through the organs of sexual organs,
right,
but
right,
through other organs and ways. Dave, there's also the role of the state in all of this, and, you know, why should it even matter to the state? You know, why not just bless this and let them be about their business?
If marriage is no more than a relationship of love, then the state has no need to recognize it. It's only as it benefits the state that a loving relationship needs to be formally recognized.
And by state, we would mean today, not as Plato did, we would mean the common good of the whole of society.
Right. And only a relationship fruitful in the bearing and rearing of children is of benefit to the state. So what purpose is there in the state recognizing a merely loving relationship which is unfruitful? Society's never recognized a couple's right to marry based only on their love for each other. Otherwise, how then could incest be forbidden, or bigamy, or marriage with a minor? The state has always set limits on who may marry and who may not.
And there are limits that are due to an awareness of the procreative dimension and the consequences of misplaced procreation within families, incest, for instance,
Right.
or within close relatives who carry the similar genetics to you, you know, the forbidden degrees of kindred. I guess you then have to ask the question, Tom, what harm could, well, let's say we ignored what, the state ignored what Dave was proposing, and that is that, you know, they have no reason to recognize this. And they said, well, we will recognize it. What actual harm is being done to society by the recognition of same-sex marriage?
We've seen the decline of marriage in the last several decades, Colin, through the things of no-fault divorce, contraception, where it's really not about two becoming one. Because even though they have, quote-unquote, the marital act, it's not a true marital act. It's not about really two becoming one. It's not ordered toward children. They're not even becoming one in a loving sense because they're undermining the love, the life-giving aspect towards which the love is ordered.
And that has societal implications?
Absolutely. It basically will point out that sex is about, you know, emotions. It's about two people, quote unquote, loving each other. And what we've seen already is its effect on children, because we've seen that things like Heather has two mommies in schools. Well, Heather only has one mommy, in fact. And then we see also that it says, well, these behaviors are okay. Two people becoming one, coming together rather in a relationship. It doesn't matter if it's two men, two women, or a man and a woman. As well, we also see it on adoption. Now homosexuals can adopt. Can homosexuals love? Yes. Do they make a fit couple together? No, because it's not a mother and father. There's not the complementarity. So we see children being raised by homosexuals. We see the biotechnological aspects as well. We also see impingements on religious liberty. A florist in Washington State being sued because she didn't want to provide flowers for a homosexual so-called wedding. We've seen it with regard to the church, Boston, the state of Illinois, adoption. No, you're not going to let homosexuals adopt. You can't play a role at all in terms of adoption. So the church is pushed away from providing homes for children in a good way. So we see it already, and it's only going to get worse if it increases across society.
Right, simply because when it's made normative in law, there will be consequences from that. Well, we're going to take a break, and we'll pick up our discussion at that point when we come back.
Ave Domina Angelorum, salve radic salve, Ave Regina Angelorum, Ave Domina Angelorum, salve radic salve porta, ex qua mundo lux est.
Well, we're back, and we're asking what possible harm legalizing same-sex marriage could have on society. Is it not just approving of something that two people do? And we've seen, certainly in the case of Roe v. Wade and abortion, the power of the law to change a culture, to change behavior within corporations, within government, and elsewhere. This is a very significant factor.
Right. I know we've talked to many people on Life on the Rock who maybe have had abortions, or on this issue about homosexuality. They have some conversion experience and they say, I was lied to, right? So the law has this teaching aspect that the law shapes beliefs, which shapes behavior. So we're going to weaken marriage if we redefine it. If the law enshrines something that's inaccurate or that's incorrect about marriage, and people believe that, that weakens when they try to attempt marriage. If their understanding of it isn't correct, of course that's going to weaken the relationship. And I think something too here, that what harm, when we're talking about same-sex marriage, is what about the children? They seem to be so secondary in consideration. Endless studies show that a mother and a father each bring something to the family that helps the normal development of the child. And certainly, sadly, there are situations with single-parent families, but it's different from enshrining that, right? From the outset, saying this is a fine thing to have. And we want to seek this normal, healthy environment for the raising of kids, and that would be a mother and a father. So,
you know, we've been hearing in the media for a long time that studies show that it's not a matter of having a mother and a father. It is whether you have two parents, that seems, but whether they're gay or whether they're heterosexual doesn't seem to matter. Now we're discovering that not only were these studies being done from an ideological point of view, but there were defects in the conduct of the studies, small and so on. Whereas recently a professor at the University of Texas did a very large study without those biases and produced the result that the same-sex marriage environment or family environment is not conducive to the raising of children, and they almost pillared him, and the University of Texas was forced into investigating him and ultimately concluded that professionally he had done his job, and that the complaints against him were, we would say, ideological, just as these previous studies had been largely ideological. So I think an honest look at this by sociologists in the future will confirm this University of Texas study, and we'll see the results of that. The Holy See pointed to this point, Father Mark, in a 2003 document which our viewers can get from EWTN's library. Considerations regarding proposals to give legal recognition to unions between homosexual persons from the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith. And they made this same point that you made. I also, a while back when I was researching this, discovered that in the 1990s, Congressman Henry Hyde, when researching the basis, arguments in favor of or against the Defense of Marriage Act, came up with, had the General Accounting Offices, which is an independent, nonpartisan, non-ideological research arm of Congress, researched the United States Code to find out if you changed the definition of marriage, what would be the implications. And in a cursory study, they found over 1,000 places where marital status had implications for benefits, for taxation, for rights and privileges and other things. So this is a huge area, especially, of course in states this is already happening, especially in the civil rights area, the question of tolerance of alternative opinions like that of Christians. But on the federal level, 1,000 is 1,000 laws or 1,000 changes in the law is probably just a ballpark figure.
Right. And I think hopefully part of this roundtable too will just awaken Christians. I know we're making arguments from reason, from natural law, but just to awaken Christians is the importance of strengthening the family. That is the fundamental cell through which all of humanity passes through. That is the foundation of society, and that the health and the way of the family is really the way of the world. So it's a vital, vital issue.
Right. You can't change something so integral to the nature of society without changing the society. Now, sometimes people make the argument, well, you know, two people in their 60s who can't have children get married, or something like this. Infertile couples get married, they're infertile, they're no longer not married. I think Tom gave us the basis of the point earlier, and that is that it's the consent, it's the willingness to have children which makes the marriage. It's not the ability or inability to have children.
Right.
So a person who ultimately is incapable of it. But what about the infertile couple? Is that really a good argument in favor of same-sex marriage?
No, because I think the heart of the argument is saying that the marital union relationship is unique. Is different from a man and a man, a woman and a woman. Whatever friendship and love they have for one another, whatever relationship they have, it's different. It is not the same reality as a marriage, and that's what we're saying the law has to protect. The reason is this consent and this bodily union that happens in marriage, it's only possible with a man and a woman. They unite to form this union that's something greater than themselves, where they enrich one another with the complementary differences due to the sexual differentiation. And that union is formed, and conception might take place. And we know biologically it might even take place hours after the conjugal act, right? But that union has already happened, right? So this is a beautiful, as Tom used language, of a crown or a gift. Human life is always a gift. But the union's taking place, period. And that union is unique to a man and a woman in marriage.
And it's that mutual support and protection. I don't know who mentioned it. May have been in that great Robert George study, which he did with a couple others on the good arguments against same-sex marriage, but I think it was mentioned in there that older people, marriage keeps them from straying, keeps them from promiscuous. Now with the women that doesn't matter, but with the man it does, because he's still fertile until the end of his life generally, although declining fertility. And so this element is important also for the older people who get married as well, sort of bonding them and keeping them in. It's not a case in the case of homosexual relations because they're incapable of procreation anyway.
Right.
And the inability to consummate, you can't get married. It's not just about consent, but if you can't consummate a marriage, you cannot get married. And it shows how that, whereas two homosexuals, they can't become two in one flesh. They can't consent because they can't really become two in one flesh. And there we see any kind of a union not going to be a real marital union.
We have a limited amount of time left, so I think we need to move on to our next question. And it has to do with homophobia. This is a word invented out of whole cloth in the 1960s by a professor to recall the fear or the inordinate fear of homosexuals. And of course it is used to say that people who hold the natural law view or the religious view of marriage are thereby homophobics. They hate homosexuals, or they fear homosexual, that there's a deep down, deep-seated fear, and that's the only reason. It's like racial bias, it's like ethnic bias, and so on. I think that's a claim that has to be answered, especially the church, who is perhaps the most noted institution in the world opposing same-sex marriage.
The church doesn't hate homosexuals. There are no doubt Catholics who have a distaste for their lifestyle, but as the Catechism says, they must be accepted with respect, compassion, and sensitivity. Every sign of unjust discrimination in their regard should be avoided. That's 2358 in the Catechism. Really, the labeling of people against the homosexual agenda as haters is just a way of maligning those who disagree with them. It's name-calling rather than a willingness to debate.
And a first-year philosophy course in logic would say it's the argument ad hominem. You're just attacking the person. You're not actually you're not putting forward a reasonable argument in favor of your position. You're just trying to destroy the reputation of your opponent. Now that has been used a lot. Cicero was famous for using this tactic back in the 1st century before Christ against his opponent. But it's not a valid argument in favor of something.
Rhetorical device.
It's a rhetorical device is all. I think there's the question also of where's the real charity here? Is it in agreeing to same-sex marriage, or is it standing for what the intellectual tradition of the West and the church in particular has always stood for?
Well, it's loving a person. It's certainly standing up for discrimination, standing up against discrimination, bullying, violence against homosexuals, but also affirming the truth. Like the great group Courageous, they encourage and help people live chaste, homosexuals live chaste lifestyles. That's the truth that sets us free, not the vice that enslaves, which is homosexuality. And a lot of people, in the name of tolerance and love, end up affirming people in lifestyles that get them into serious sexually transmitted diseases, even death, AIDS, and also can lead them toward a more significant thing, which is spiritual death if someone doesn't repent. So in the name of tolerance, people are not really loving. In addition, we see that a lot of times we see a solidarity in vice. I'm for contraception, I'm for adultery, fornication. I'm going to stand with you because I'm kind of guilty myself, and we'll come together and support each other in our respective vices. And that's a prescription for societal erosion, as we've seen the last several decades.
And I think you can go back to Humanae Vitae and the question of contraception and identify abortion connected to this same phenomena. You can't criticize those who are in difficult circumstances, even though I personally am not against it. And now with same-sex marriage, a similar perspective. I think sometimes what comes up too from this point of view is, are we denying the individual rights that they need to have? even if the church takes a position of tolerance, which it is noted for doing. The church has said it is permissible to tolerate, for instance, Aquinas taught this, in a culture, prostitution, if it would be a greater evil to go around and to end that practice totally by, we would say today, a police state or something like this. And likewise, the church is not saying we need to end homosexual practice, because that would be even more odious. But what about two homosexuals, their rights in terms of visiting each other in the hospital and so on, Dave? Are they actually being deprived of any true, authentic rights by failing to have same-sex marriage?
Yeah, I can't see that that's the case. Civil unions, of course, have been proposed as perhaps an alternative to real marriage, but I don't think that will satisfy the homosexual agenda. I think what they're really going for is not additional rights, but recognition by society as their unions being on a par with traditional marriage. So it's approbation that they're looking for rather than rights, to my way of thinking.
I think you are. You mentioned, as we come to the end of the program here, you mentioned civil unions, and the question is sometimes asked, well, if the church doesn't favor same-sex marriage, can it grant civil unions? Can it say, well, that's okay? And the answer to that is the church can't say that civil unions are a legitimate thing. But what they can say is something we've heard that Pope Francis, when he was Cardinal Bergoglio in Argentina, suggested to the Argentine bishops that, well, you've got this avalanche in favor of what if we said, well, why not have civil unions? That's called proposing the lesser evil. And this could be done in some circumstances where it seems evident you can't forestall the greater evil, but like an individual who says to a robber who is going to also kill them, or is threatening to kill them, look, rob me, take all my money, or take all of his money, just don't kill me. And they're proposing the lesser evil in order to prevent the individual from doing the greater evil. That can be permissible in some circumstances. I think today, in the United States at least, the point you make about the ideological element means that it's not a solution in the United States, because the ideological attack and drive is so strong to the full and complete acceptance that civil unions would simply be a way of saying, oh, well, we've got this, why not marriage? So it's a potentially possible area of proposing the lesser evil, but it's not practically speaking going to be, and therefore it would not be morally illicit, because there would be no advantage to doing it. It would simply be giving them the first step towards that.
Not morally illicit, yeah. Not
morally illicit at this point, although it could be in some set of circumstances where it could actually accomplish its aim of reducing the evil as being proposed.
Kind of reducing abortions if you have abortion on demand.
Right, you vote for something restricted, even though you're not in favor of the abortions that would be permitted. Well, sadly, we've come to the end of our time, and I hope that our discussion has helped thrown some light on the question of same-sex marriage, and that at least causes you to go out and to investigate it a little bit more, and not be satisfied as what you're hearing from the media and the culture regarding the validity of this lifestyle and the validity of same-sex marriage. God bless.
Ave Domina Angelorum, salve radic, salve porta, ex qua mundo luces volta, cade Virgo gloriosa, super omnes speciosa, vale o vale de cora, et pro nobis Christum exora.
Dignare me laudare te, Virgo sacrata,
Da mihi virtutem contra hostes tu,